This is the image they tried to bury: a massive steel valve, 6 feet in diameter, painted red with the Canadian maple leaf, slowly grinding shut on the Alberta-Montana border. For 70 years, that valve never closed. Not during the Cold War, not during 9/11, not during the 2008 financial collapse. It stayed open because both nations understood a simple truth: energy is blood, and the pipeline is the artery. But as of 6 a.m. this morning, Monday, February 23rd, 2026, the blood stopped flowing. For the first time in the history of North American energy integration, Canada has initiated a formal restriction on crude oil exports to the United States. This is not a threat. This is not a negotiating posture. This is an executive order signed by Prime Minister Mark Carney, invoking emergency powers under the Canada Energy Regulator Act, directing a phased reduction of pipeline throughput by 1.2 million barrels per day. The taps are turning, the refineries are panicking, and the White House is in absolute chaos. Breaking news this morning confirms what energy analysts have feared for months. The trade war that Donald Trump started with 25% tariffs on Canadian goods has finally hit the one target he swore would never fight back: the energy sector. We are talking about Enbridge Line 5, the 540,000 barrel per day lifeline that feeds refineries across Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. We are talking about the Keystone Mainline system, carrying 590,000 barrels a day from Alberta to Illinois and Texas. We are talking about the Trans Mountain diversion, where Canada is now rerouting crude to Asian buyers through Vancouver at a $4 premium over what American refiners were paying. We are talking about a $90 billion annual energy trade relationship that just got a knife through the heart. Sources inside the Department of Energy describe the mood as apocalyptic. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how Trump's tariff war provoked the one retaliation nobody thought possible. We are going to explain the financial mechanics of how 4 million barrels of daily imports get replaced or don't. We are going to reveal why the Supreme Court's IEPA ruling 4 days ago made this crisis 10 times worse. And we are going to answer the question that every American with a car, a furnace, or a 401k needs to hear: how high do gas prices go and how fast? Buckle up, the energy war just went hot. To understand why Canada pulled the trigger today, you have to go back to February 1st, 2025. That is the day Donald Trump signed 3 executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on virtually all Canadian imports, with a 10% levy on energy. At the time, the conventional wisdom was that Canada would never retaliate on oil. The logic was simple: Canada sends 97% of its crude exports to the United States. Cutting off your biggest customer is economic suicide. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said it explicitly. Under no circumstances would Alberta agree to cut off oil and gas exports. The Energy Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, kept the threat vague. Everything is on the table, he said, but the table stayed set and the food never moved. For 12 months, Canada absorbed the punishment. Their GDP fell 2.5%. Inflation surged to 7%. 150,000 jobs evaporated, and Trump kept escalating. In January 2026, he threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports if Ottawa finalized a trade deal with China. Then on February 8th, he threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a $5.7 billion infrastructure project that Canada built entirely with its own money. But here is the catch. The game changed on February 20th, 2026. That is the day the United States Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice Roberts, ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Learning Resources versus Trump. The ruling gutted the legal foundation of every IEPA tariff Trump had imposed since taking office. The reciprocal tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, the Canada tariffs, all of them unconstitutional. The court was unambiguous. IEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties. The government points to no statute in which Congress used the word regulate to authorize taxation. And until now, no president has read IEPA to confer such power. Within hours, Trump signed an executive order replacing the IEPA tariffs with a new 10% global surcharge under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. By the next morning, he raised it to 15%. But here is what nobody is talking about. The Supreme Court ruling did not just invalidate the tariffs going forward, it created a $175 billion refund liability. That is the total amount collected under IEEPA authority since March 2025, according to the Penn-Wharton budget model. Canadian businesses, American importers, and a coalition of states are now lining up to claw that money back. The Treasury is hemorrhaging. And this is the moment Canada saw its opening. Sources close to the Carney government say the calculation was brutally simple. Trump is legally weakened, his tariff authority is fractured. The Supreme Court told the world his trade war was built on an illegal foundation, and his replacement tariffs under Section 122 are capped at 15% and expire in 150 days. For the first time in 2 years, Canada has leverage. The energy restriction order signed this morning is not a full shutdown. That is a critical distinction. Canada cannot afford to turn off the taps entirely because its own eastern provinces, Ontario and Quebec, receive their crude through pipelines that pass through American territory. The infrastructure was designed in the 1950s as a continental system. The pipes from Alberta go south into Wisconsin and Michigan before looping back up to Sarnia, Ontario. Cut the flow completely and you starve your own refineries. So the Carney order is surgical. It targets throughput reductions on export-heavy lines while maintaining minimum domestic supply. According to leaked briefing documents obtained by the Globe and Mail, the specific targets are as follows. Target 1, the Enbridge Mainline system. This is the backbone of Canadian crude exports, carrying roughly 3 million barrels per day across the border. Enbridge accounts for 40% of total U.S. crude oil imports. The order directs a 400,000 barrel per day reduction in throughput, effective within 72 hours. The mechanism is a regulatory instruction to the Canada Energy Regulator to reduce approved export volumes. This hits Midwest refineries in Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan first. These facilities are specifically configured to process heavy, sour Canadian crude. They cannot simply switch to light, sweet domestic oil from the Permian Basin. The chemistry does not work. The catalytic crackers are wrong. The desulfurization units are calibrated for bitumen-derived feedstock. Retooling takes months and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Target 2, Keystone Mainline throughput. The existing Keystone system, not the canceled XL extension, moves 590,000 barrels a day from Hardisty, Alberta, to Cushing, Oklahoma, and onward to Gulf Coast refineries in Texas. The order calls for a 200,000 barrel reduction. This directly impacts the strategic petroleum hub at Cushing, which serves as the pricing benchmark for West Texas intermediate crude. When Cushing inventories drop, WTI prices spike. When WTI spikes, gasoline prices at every pump in America follow within 48 hours. Energy economists at the University of Houston estimate that a sustained 600,000 barrel per day reduction in Canadian supply would add 25 to 40 cents per gallon at the pump within 2 weeks. With diesel and jet fuel hit even harder because those products depend disproportionately on heavy crude feedstock. Target 3, the Trans Mountain diversion. This is the strategic masterstroke. The Trans Mountain expansion, completed in May 2024 at a cost of $34 billion, gives Canada something it never had before, a pipeline to tidewater that does not cross American soil. TMX carries 890,000 barrels a day to the port of Vancouver, where tankers ship crude to China, Japan, and South Korea. Before TMX, Canada was trapped. It had no choice but to sell to American refiners at a discount. The Western Canadian Select differential was as wide as $30 a barrel. Now, with TMX operational, that differential has collapsed to under $5. Canada can sell to Asia at world prices. Sources say the Carney government is actively negotiating increased offtake agreements with Sinopec and PetroChina, redirecting barrels that would have gone south to Houston and instead sending them west to Shanghai. The message to Washington is unmistakable. You are no longer our only customer. And you just became our most expensive one. This is where the situation moves from energy crisis to economic catastrophe. Let me explain the financial plumbing that is about to rupture. The United States imported approximately 4 million barrels of crude oil per day from Canada throughout 2024 and 2025. That represents 60% of total U.S. crude imports and roughly 20% of total U.S. refinery input. We are not talking about a marginal supply disruption. We are talking about 1/5 of the feedstock that keeps the American industrial economy running. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizer. Every product derived from a barrel of oil touches this supply chain. And here is the domino effect that the Department of Energy's own modeling shows. A 600,000 barrel reduction triggers a spot price increase of $8 to $12 per barrel on WTI within the first week. Crack spreads, the margin between crude input costs and refined product output prices, compress violently. Refiners who cannot source replacement heavy crude face the choice of running at reduced capacity or paying premium prices for alternative imports from Mexico, Venezuela, or the Middle East. But Mexican heavy crude from Pemex is declining in production. Venezuela, even after the recent upheaval, cannot ramp output quickly. And Middle Eastern barrels take 45 days to arrive by tanker versus 48 hours by pipeline from Alberta. It gets worse. The timing of this energy restriction could not be more devastating for the American economy. Remember, the Supreme Court just struck down the IEEPA tariffs 4 days ago. Markets are already in turmoil over the $175 billion refund liability. The S&P 500 dropped 3.2% on Friday. Bond yields spiked as investors priced in the fiscal uncertainty of the government potentially owing back nearly $180 billion to importers. Now layer on an energy supply shock. The combination is a stagflationary nightmare. Prices rising while growth contracts. The Federal Reserve cannot cut rates to stimulate the economy because inflation is accelerating from the energy shock. But it cannot raise rates either because the economy is already weakened from a year of trade war damage. The Fed is paralyzed. And the president, who is scheduled to deliver the State of the Union address tonight, February 24th, has no tools left. His tariff authority was just gutted by the Supreme Court. His replacement tariffs are temporary and capped. His energy supply is being throttled by a country he spent 2 years antagonizing, and his approval ratings, already cratered from the trade war, are about to face the one number that Americans understand viscerally: the price at the gas pump. Sources inside the West Wing describe the president as apoplectic. He reportedly spent Saturday night on the phone with his national security team demanding options. The word nationalize was used. Multiple officials confirmed that Trump floated the idea of invoking the Defense Production Act to compel domestic energy companies to increase output. But here is the reality. American oil production is already at record highs, over 13 million barrels per day. The shale producers in the Permian Basin are running near capacity. You cannot snap your fingers and add 600,000 barrels of heavy crude production overnight. The geology does not work that way. American crude is predominantly light, sweet oil. The refineries that process Canadian heavy crude need heavy crude. It is like telling a diesel engine to run on premium unleaded. The machine does not care about your executive orders. The second option reportedly discussed was direct retaliation. Seize Canadian assets. Freeze Enbridge's American operations. The idea was floated that since Enbridge pipelines run through American territory, the U.S. could simply take control of the infrastructure under eminent domain. But the legal team immediately flagged the 1977 Transit Pipeline Treaty between the United States and Canada, which explicitly prohibits either government from interfering with the operation of cross-border pipelines. Violating that treaty would trigger an international legal crisis that would make the IEEPA ruling look like a parking ticket. It would also spook every foreign energy company operating in America. If the government can seize Canadian pipelines, what stops them from seizing Saudi Aramco's refining operations in Port Arthur or Shell's facilities in Deer Park? Capital flight from the American energy sector would be immediate and catastrophic. The third option, and the one reportedly being prepared as we speak, is a direct call to Ottawa. Capitulation framed as negotiation. Sources say the White House counsel's office is drafting a framework for a 90-day cooling-off period. The problem is that Trump has spent 2 years publicly humiliating Canada. He called it a state. He mocked their prime minister. He threatened to annex their territory. The political dynamics in Ottawa make it impossible for Carney to give Trump an easy off-ramp. 75% of Canadians support restricting U.S. access to Canadian resources. The public mood is not conciliatory. It is furious. Let us push this to the worst case. What happens if the energy restriction holds for 30 days? Within 2 weeks, gasoline prices in the Midwest and Northeast reach $5 per gallon. Diesel crosses $6. Trucking companies begin surcharging every shipment. Food prices spike another 8 to 12% as transportation costs cascade through the supply chain. Airlines whose jet fuel costs have jumped 30% begin canceling routes. Heating oil in New England, where millions of homes depend on oil furnaces, becomes unaffordable for fixed-income retirees. The human cost lands hardest on the people who can least absorb it. But here is what nobody is talking about. The Enbridge Line 5 crisis was already simmering before any of this happened. A Wisconsin federal court ordered Enbridge to shut down a 12-mile section of Line 5 running through the Bad River Band Reservation by June 2026. That order is currently under appeal, but the legal trajectory is clear. Line 5, which carries 540,000 barrels a day and supplies refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Ontario, was already facing a potential shutdown from the American side. Michigan's governor revoked the pipeline's operating easement in 2020. Environmental groups call it a ticking time bomb. Now add Canada's voluntary throughput reduction on top of the court-ordered shutdown threat, and you have the makings of a complete collapse in Great Lakes region energy supply. Refineries in Sarnia, Ontario, that feed jet fuel to Toronto Pearson International Airport would go dry. Detroit refineries that supply gasoline to the entire upper Midwest would throttle back. The cascading effect hits everything from agriculture to manufacturing to air travel. And the geopolitical consequences are staggering. What does China think when it sees this? Beijing has been courting Canadian energy for years. The Trans Mountain expansion was the first crack in the continental energy monopoly. Now, with Canada actively redirecting crude to Asian markets, China sees an opportunity to lock in long-term supply agreements at the expense of American energy security. Sources say that Sinopec representatives have been in Calgary for the past 2 weeks, negotiating a 10-year offtake deal worth an estimated $22 billion. If that deal closes, it is not just about oil, it is about the geopolitical realignment of North America's most valuable natural resource away from the United States and toward its primary strategic competitor. Trump threatened 100% tariffs if Canada made a trade deal with China. Canada responded by selling China the one thing America cannot replace. What does OPEC think? They see a weakened American president who just lost his tariff authority, whose energy supply is being cut by his closest ally, and whose economy is teetering between recession and inflation. Saudi Arabia has zero incentive to increase production to bail out the United States. Higher prices benefit the kingdom. American desperation benefits their leverage. The Saudis remember Trump demanding they pump more. They remember him threatening them. Now they watch him beg. The Saudis are not known for generosity when they smell weakness. The political fallout inside the United States is splitting the Republican base. The MAGA faithful see this as Canadian aggression. Send the troops, seize the pipelines. But the business wing, the donors, the CEOs, they see a self-inflicted wound. They see a trade war that was always going to end with the other side hitting back. The energy executives in Houston, the refinery operators in Whiting, Indiana, the pipeline companies, they are not rallying behind Trump. They are calling their lobbyists and screaming for a deal. Because every day this restriction continues, their margins evaporate and their stock prices hemorrhage. History teaches us that energy crises end presidencies. Nixon's price controls, Carter's gas lines. The 1973 Arab oil embargo reshaped American foreign policy for a generation. The pattern is always the same. A leader picks a fight. The other side uses energy as a weapon. The American public does not tolerate $5 gasoline. There is a psychological threshold. When filling a tank costs $80 or $90, people stop blaming the other country. They start blaming their own president. The midterms are 9 months away. If gas prices are elevated by summer, the consequences for Republican candidates in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin, states that depend most on Canadian crude, are existential. This is the stress test of the North American Energy Alliance. For 70 years, since those pipelines were first laid across the border in the 1950s, the United States and Canada operated on an assumption so fundamental that nobody bothered to write it down. We do not weaponize energy against each other. That assumption is dead. The USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, maintained provisions on energy cooperation. The 1977 Transit Pipeline Treaty enshrined the principle of uninterrupted flow, but treaties are paper, and paper burns when the political temperature gets hot enough. What we are witnessing is the unraveling of continental energy security, the doctrine that made North America functionally energy independent. Canada is not just restricting oil to punish Trump, it is building the infrastructure to permanently diversify away from the United States. The proposed 1 million barrel per day pipeline to the Pacific coast, the expansion of Trans Mountain, the talks to revive Energy East to ship crude from Alberta to New Brunswick for tanker export to Europe. All of these projects, which were considered economically marginal or politically impossible 2 years ago, are now being fast-tracked with public support that would have been unimaginable before the trade war. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a structural realignment. Once Canada builds the infrastructure to sell its oil globally, the United States loses its monopsony buyer advantage forever. The discount American refiners enjoyed for decades on Western Canadian Select disappears. The strategic cushion of having a friendly, captive supplier evaporates. And the cost of that loss, measured in higher energy prices and diminished geopolitical leverage, compounds every single year. The bill for the trade war will not arrive as a single invoice. It will arrive as a permanent increase in the cost of doing business in America. So as we head into tonight's State of the Union address, watch for three things. Watch for Trump's language on Canada. If he escalates, threatens, or insults Carney, the restriction tightens. If he offers an olive branch, there might be a path to negotiation, but his ego has not historically permitted olive branches. Watch the crude oil futures when markets open. WTI March contracts were already up $4.50 in overnight trading. If they breach $85, the cascade into retail gasoline prices accelerates. And watch the refinery utilization reports from the Energy Information Administration on Wednesday. If Midwest refinery runs drop below 85%, the physical supply crunch has begun, and no amount of political theater will fill the gap. But most importantly, watch the premium on Western Canadian Select. If the discount to WTI narrows further, or if Canadian crude begins trading at parity or even a premium, it means the Asian buyers have absorbed the redirected volume. It means the new trade routes are hardening. It means the structural divorce of North American energy is not a threat anymore. It is a fact. For a man who promised energy dominance, who signed executive orders on his first day to unleash American energy, who made drill baby drill his mantra, the supreme irony is this. The energy crisis of 2026 was not caused by a foreign adversary. It was not caused by OPEC. It was not caused by climate regulations or green energy mandates. It was caused by tariffs, his tariffs, imposed on America's largest energy supplier, the one country that for 70 years never once turned off the valve. The valve is turning now. And the sound you hear, that grinding metal, that pressurized hiss as 1.2 million barrels per day stop flowing south, that is the sound of energy dominance dying. It is the sound of consequences. Subscribe, stay tuned. The pipeline is closed and the price is about to be paid. Let us get technical about what happens inside a refinery when Canadian heavy crude disappears. Refineries are not generic machines. They are custom-built ecosystems. The coker units, the fluid catalytic crackers, the hydrodesulfurization towers, every component is optimized for the sulfur content, API gravity, and viscosity of its feedstock. Over 70% of U.S. Midwest refining capacity is designed for heavy, sour crude. That is Canadian oil. Substitute light Permian crude, and the yield changes. More gasoline, but less diesel. Less jet fuel, less petrochemical feedstock. Diesel powers every truck, every train, every piece of farm equipment in the country. A diesel shortage is a food shortage waiting to happen. When the Keystone pipeline ruptured in April 2025, spilling 147,000 gallons in North Dakota, experts warned that even a temporary shutdown would raise fuel prices within days. That was one pipeline, briefly. What we face now is a sustained reduction across multiple systems. The maps are useless. The playbook is gone. We are in uncharted waters, and the ink writing this history is crude oil.